So far, we've seen evidence of editing in the Torah and different perspectives of its various law collections. It's time now to consider where parts of the Torah actually modify previous laws, and even sometimes outright contradict them, and what such differences can perhaps tell us about the authors. Bear in mind that this is not an exhaustive list of differences between laws, but only a sampling. Exodus 21 says that a Hebrew slave is to be released in the seventh year without payment. Deuteronomy 15 adds that when you let him go free, you must not let him go empty-handed, but to give provisions. So we see that the Deuteronomy Code adds to the law of Exodus and is more concerned with the welfare of the poor. Another example of this concerns lending to one's fellow Israelite. While both Exodus 22 and Deuteronomy 15 prohibit the charging of interest, Deuteronomy goes further by requiring a 7-year release from all debts on the so-called sabbatical year. Deuteronomy's release of slaves may also refer to releasing slaves on the sabbatical year rather than the seventh year of service. The wording seems ambiguous, and again, the sabbatical year is not found in Exodus. But Deuteronomy does not just seem to alter the Exodus code by adding the requirement of giving Hebrew slaves goods when they go out free. It actually seems to reverse the Exodus 21 rule that allows a female slave to be essentially kept forever, without the seventh year release. Exodus 21:7, in regard to a man's daughter whom he sells as a slave, says explicitly, quote, "She shall not go out as male slaves do," end quote. In other words, in the seventh year, which had just been detailed for male Hebrew slaves. Deuteronomy 15, on the other hand, explicitly applies the 7-year release to both male and female Hebrew slaves, as if it was repealing Exodus 21. So far, we're seeing these contradictions through our Western eyes. In a moment, we'll explore how some of these may not have actually been contradictions at all based on ancient conventions of expression of law. So what can such differences tell us? Firstly, there's quite a bit of overlap between these laws, so they are not random collections thrown together into one Torah. Secondly, the Deuteronomistic school appears to rely on and be a modification on Exodus. What is the difference in the views of the author of Deuteronomy besides apparent greater concern for the poor? We can tease out at least one more detail regarding motive by comparing one more difference. For Exodus 21, a slave who wishes to forever remain with his master is to be brought to God, most likely to one of the places that God would have his priests officiate. Recall that from a previous lesson that Exodus seems to have in view a plurality of places where God could cause his name to be remembered. But for Deuteronomy, which alone emphasizes the centrality of Yahweh worship, it would probably be burdensome to have many slave owners bring their slave all the way to the one central place where God would choose to make his name dwell. So the owner can simply perform the ceremony of making his slave permanent at the entrance of his own house. Note that this is quite ironically opposite to the places of the sacrifice of the Paschal lamb in the two books, as detailed in the previous lesson. But wait, there's more. Unlike Deuteronomy 15, Leviticus 25 is totally different from the Exodus law regarding Hebrew slaves, and only shares a few parallels with Deuteronomy, from which it mostly differs as well. Leviticus 25 seems to outright ban enslavement of fellow Israelites, and requires that a poor Hebrew who has fallen into servitude be treated well, like indentured servants. It says that they shall be with you as a hired laborer, end quote. Note that this builds on the generosity of Deuteronomy 15, which only says you should give them gifts when they go out. Leviticus 25 also requires that the servant and their families were to be released to return to their property of their inheritance, but not on the seventh year, as in Deuteronomy 15, but on the year of Jubilee, which only came around every 50 years. So the idea of treating your fellow Israelite not as a slave, but as a brother, is found in both Deuteronomy and Leviticus, but the details of the laws are quite different. Some scholars believe that Leviticus is a later modification of Deuteronomy because of their few parallels. These two passages also share another similarity in their terminology. Unlike Exodus 21, which speaks of a Hebrew slave or servant, Deuteronomy 15 and Leviticus 25 speak of your Hebrew brother or kinsman. Again, our purpose is not merely to point out differences and contradictions, but to see what they tell us about the biblical authors, their beliefs, and maybe even other details about them and when they wrote. We've presented some such evidence for the authorship of Deuteronomy, which has some very clear beliefs and worldviews which show in its teachings. Exodus has less evidence of being a special school. Leviticus, on the other hand, is from quite a different school than Deuteronomy, focused on priestly law and emphasizing holiness. Another way that we can see differences in the legal systems and their authorial perspectives found throughout the Torah regards who can be punished for a crime. Although the Mosaic law did indeed have many progressive laws for its time, it also had many parallels with the laws of the nations, as I noted previously. But as we saw with the slave laws, we can even see progression within the Torah itself, as its laws were adapted, modified, and sometimes even altered. And perhaps the best example of this regards when and under what circumstances intergenerational punishment was permitted. In Exodus 34, 6-7, we're told that God visits the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generations. Yet Deuteronomy 24:16 explicitly says that the son shall not be put to death for the sins of the father, and vice versa. I've always heard preachers and Sunday school teachers explain this by saying that the consequences of sin fall on the offspring, yet not the guilt of the sin. There's just one problem with this interpretation. It does not match the actual application of the law with God's approval after the time frame of the Torah, and even within the Torah itself. We'll consider an example of both. As a side note, many scholars and perhaps Jewish apologists see the Exodus law as a mercy, as spreading the punishment out. I would argue the opposite, that this expression is actually intended to convey the severity of God's punishment. Now we'll need to go outside the Torah to see how these differing laws were actually applied in what scholars call the Deuteronomistic history. Judge for yourself if these narratives agree more with Deuteronomy or Exodus regarding intergenerational punishment. 2 Samuel 21 is an incredibly interesting story. We're told that God caused a 3-year famine on the land. When David inquired of Yahweh, he was told that it was because of blood guilt on the land, which was from Saul killing Gibeonites, to whom the children of Israel had sworn an oath not to kill, despite God's command to kill them. The idea that the entire nation could be punishment for the sins of individuals is another facet of this discussion, but for now we'll just focus on the sons being punished for the sins of their fathers. First, note that the people as a whole are being punished for the sins of a man who is dead, and more specifically, David killed Saul's sons. God then relented and again sent rain to water the crops. In other words, God approved of the execution of Saul's sons for the sins of their fathers. Interestingly, too, it was the Gibeonites who actually named the punishment, not explicit revelation from God. The nation of Judah is also said to be punished for the sins of Manasseh, long after his death, and even after the reforms of Josiah, who served Yahweh like no king before. In fact, he is perhaps presented as the quintessential son of David, who finally ushered in a period of pure, centralized Yahweh worship. This seems very odd, then, for punishment for the sins of Manasseh to be withheld until the nation was actually serving God. But maybe one of the most curious stories of intergenerational punishment is with Ahab, who is presented as perhaps the epitome of an evil king who rejects Yahweh. For there was none who sold himself to do evil in the sight of Yahweh like Ahab. Elijah confronts Ahab in the very vineyard for which he has just murdered a man, and told him that his entire household would be destroyed for his sin. When Ahab tears his clothes and puts on sackcloth in mourning and ostensibly repentance, God relents a little and says that he will not bring the disaster in his days, but in the days of his son. I'll rephrase that in case you missed it. God is not going to punish Ahab for his sins because he repented. Instead, God will punish his son for Ahab's sins. Now let's go back to the Torah. We've already seen how different voices are found across the laws of the Torah, particularly in Deuteronomy. We've noted that God visits the iniquity of the fathers on the children in Exodus. Numbers also agrees. Did God in the Torah approve of executing children for the sins of their fathers, as David did to the sons of Saul? Because if so, I don't believe the argument holds up that says Exodus is in harmony with Deuteronomy because it's not speaking of guilt, only consequences of sin. To understand the differing views of these laws, we now turn to 2 stories in the time frame of the Torah. The first account is one we've already seen, the punishment of Dathan and Abiram in Numbers 16. But if you read the account carefully, you see that it's not just they who were punished. Moses told the congregation to get away from those men's tents, with their wives, their sons, and their little ones. When God caused the earth to swallow them, he also executed the families for the fathers' sins, including their little children. The second account is most like the story of David killing Saul's sons for Saul's sins. because it is not God's hand that does the killing, but the people's. It is the account of Achan, who actually falls just outside the narrative of the Torah in Joshua 7. Recall that God has already let people be killed in battle because of Achan's sin of touching plunder, which was supposed to be devoted to destruction. But when they go to punish Achan, according to the direct revelation from Yahweh, there are a few details that I imagine most Sunday school classes don't notice. In order to purge the sin from Israel, they must not only devote Achan to destruction, but also the plunder he took, his livestock, his tent, and everything in it, including his sons and daughters. And they burned them with fire and stoned them with stones. Lovely story. We've already noted how Deuteronomy appeared to be a later perspective in the way that it modified the Exodus laws regarding slavery, and in its being the only law in the Torah regarding centralized worship, and this not being practiced by the kings of Israel for hundreds of years. So too, Deuteronomy also takes what is perhaps a more modern view of justice, where the children are not punished for the father's crimes. We see the view of Exodus in the story of David killing Saul's sons. The first time we see the Deuteronomistic view appears in 2 Kings 14, where Amaziah does not execute sons of the men who killed his father, according to, quote, the book of the law of Moses, end quote. He ruled in the first half of the 8th century BC, a couple of hundred years after David. We see Psalm 103, 8-10 reference the passage in Exodus 34, 6-7, yet it seems modified at the end. The Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness. Yet here the psalm departs from Exodus. Instead of extending his punishment of guilt for generations, as in Exodus, the psalm says that he will not always accuse nor extend his anger forever. A similar revising restatement of Exodus 34 actually appears in Deuteronomy itself, in Deuteronomy 7, 9-10. The list of differences in the Torah's perspectives could go on and on. For instance, why is there a passage that says God did not make himself known by the name Yahweh before, when earlier accounts clearly show that he did? And why does Exodus 33 appear to be oblivious to the fact that the tabernacle has not yet been built? Was there a temporary tent of meeting before the new tent of meeting was built? And why was it pitched outside the camp if they were commanded to pitch the tent of meeting in the center of the camp in Numbers 2? And try to nail down the age a Levite had to be in order to serve the tabernacle. Numbers 4 places the minimum at 30 years old and states it a significant 7 times, but chapter 8 says the age is 25. David would later change it to yet another age, 20 years old, but there's no need to keep citing these. We've seen enough differences between the Torah, some of them outright contradictions. I'd like to pause at this point and make some useful observations. We've seen that the Torah actually contains collections of laws, not one unified legal system. These collections often overlap and agree, but often they will modify one another and sometimes even outright contradict each other. We can even see that some came later by the way that they modify earlier ones. These are excellent opportunities for improving our understanding of when certain laws were actually in place and how the legal system of Israel evolved over time. But there is perhaps a more valuable and fascinating observation that we can now make. It's been argued that certain men in power, such as Ezra, were responsible for pushing through a certain text as authoritative. To a certain extent, this is not inconsistent with the Bible's own testimony, especially regarding Moses. In a previous series on how additions were made to the Bible, I covered how the ancients sometimes did not seem to have the same attitudes towards sacred texts, and would sometimes openly modify them, even attaching obvious additions to the ends of older books. I'll link that lesson below. However, the irony of this is that they would quite often leave the earlier text untouched and simply add more material which modified or even contradicted the previous texts. They even treated the early text as sacred without trying to argue with them, even while contradicting them. It seems like a paradox to the modern mind, but that's exactly what they did. So in a sense, fundamentalist apologists are actually right. The texts have quite often been preserved, just not in the way preferred by those who hold a drop from the sky complete view of inspired books. Now we'll see how some of these laws, which appear to contradict from our modern perspective, actually did not contradict based on ancient ways of interpreting law in the next lesson.